I'm now going to look at adding crowds to the course. Now this is something that's probably given designers more problems than anything else. Not because it's a difficult technique, it's incredibly easy to add crowds. The problem comes with all the crashing that can happen uh, while you're trying to add them. So I'm going to talk about how to try and avoid the crashes, but first we'll just look at uh, how I go about planting crowds. The first thing you need to do is take a look at your hole and decide where the crowds are going. If you want a realistic look to your course, obviously the crowd should be in realistic positions. So people tend not to watch golf standing waist deep in high grass or in a valley where they can't actually see the action. You'll tend to get less crowds in the more uninteresting places. So obviously tees and greens are going to have more crowds around than the middle of fairways. And also the first hole is likely to have a bigger crowd. The 18th obviously is going to have larger crowds. And the crowds tend to build up towards the end. So I try to increase my crowds from about the 12th hole and then make them more and more dense up until the 18th. It gives a more realistic feel that the crowd is building up towards the end of the round. So yeah, have a quick look round, decide where the best place to plant your crowds are. There is an issue with links where it won't draw crowds on the left side of the screen. You'll have seen this many times with courses, especially if they've got stands and suddenly the crowd are only in the right half of the stand for some reason. You think that's a bit odd. There's a half-filled stand or an empty stand, and it's just because links can't draw the crowds in on the left-hand side of the screen. So if you plant crowds on the left-hand side of a tee, when you tee off, you're not going to see them. They'll be visible from a reverse cam or other views from around the course, but when you're actually playing the shot, if you plant crowds along here, along this left side of the tee, you're not going to see them. You could make your own 2D object crowds and plant those. 2D objects display fine at the left hand side of the screen, so that's one way around it. But to be honest, I've never bothered to go into that much work just to create a crowd. So once you've decided where you're going to have the crowds, there's two ways of planting, the same as 2D objects, singly or forest planting. So I tend to forest plant first and then add a few individual people later. So best thing to do once you've decided where you want the crowd, turn the 2D objects off. This will make moving around the course easier. It'll also save memory, which is one of the things that's, well, it's the thing that causes the crashes, is a memory overflow of the crowds. So by turning off your 2D objects, you'll immediately reduce the chances of crashes. So I'm going to go to the top view and I'm just going to draw a shape to forest plant in my crowd. So go to shapes, select a colour that I want to use for my crowds. So I'm going to choose concrete, have white, turn the freehand off because I want to just plot it in, and I'm going to just decide where my crowd's going. So I'm going to start it around this T, and I'll add it here, going around the T. And then along the path, I'll have the crowd pinching in a bit across this so I can get a larger crowd. And around this bunker, I'm going to finish it at this bunker here. So So I've got my crowd shape. I'll then add another one up here to the crowd on the left hand side. For now, demoing, we'll just leave it at that. And to plant a crowd forest, we go to planting, people, select the forest plant crowd option, and just like 2D objects, we select our shape, so we highlight it, and we set the crowd density. This is just a matter of preference for the amount of crowd and type of course you've got. I usually go around the 8 foot, I think, and just click, and the crowd's planted. If it's not right, just undo it and try a different number. Let's say 6. So that's as simple as crowd planting is. As I say, crashing is the main problem, and the main cause of crashing is moving the screen with the crowd on. So if you scroll about in the screen here, your memory will slowly fill up until it gets to the point where it overflows and the crowd will start disappearing. It will eventually freeze up, but it will also, once it gets past the point of no return, it will start doing very strange things. It could move your crowd to other places. They'll start disappearing, but they can reappear underground, in the sky. All sorts of nasty things can happen. So to avoid that, if you're going to move about in the screen, turn your crowd off after you've planted them, move to the new position, scroll to where you want to have a look, and then turn them on again. That will eliminate that memory issue. It's a pain doing it, but it will certainly reduce awful lot of crashes. Also, I'd recommend don't move your crowd if they're in the wrong place. Don't select them and try and move them. Select them, delete them, and reapply them in a new place. So just add them in a new place rather than moving them. So if you want to move this person here over here, you're better off selecting them, deleting them, and wherever you want the new person, just hand plant a person and click. Because moving crowds around is another big cause of crashing, so I would always recommend you do that. Also, it saves you accidentally moving them in the wrong axis. If they're in the Z axis and you move a crowd in a Z axis up and down, even if it's just a fraction, they won't then behave properly as a crowd. So in the game, normally, if you've got a shot through a crowd, the crowd part in links and let you play your shot, which is how a crowd would react. But if you've moved any of your people in the Z axis, they won't disappear and they'll just stand in the way of the shot. So if you've got a shot through a crowd of people, there'll just be a crowd of people still standing in front of you, which is not what you want. So you don't want to move any of your crowd in the Z axis. Another thing to do once you've planted one hole is to save it and exit. I've talked about this in a very early video. It's the way to stop most crashes happening in APCD. Is to save frequently, but also after you have saved, don't just carry on working. Exit APCD, shut it down, and then boot it up again and load in the course again. Now, I'd suggest with crowds you do this after every hole, and plant one hole of crowd, save, exit, come back in, plant the next. And if you do that, you shouldn't have any problems with crowd crashing, coupled with avoiding moving around with the crowd turned on. Should solve any crashing problems. Obviously, if you've got a really slow computer and it's taking 15-20 minutes to save your course or longer, it's not really an option to save each hole. So in that instance, what I'd suggest you do is plot in your shapes for your crowds on 3 or 4 holes. Don't plant them, just draw the shapes in. And when you're ready to plant, you can group select the shapes by clicking on a shape, then holding shift down, clicking on more shapes, and you can plant all of those shapes in one go and then save it and exit. And when you come back in, turn the crowds off again so that you can move about and it won't crash. So if you follow those instructions, hopefully you'll have very few crashes when you're planting crowds. Tournament objects are associated with crowds as well. Obviously, if you want to put tournament objects in, make sure that they are set as tournament objects. If you go to 3D planting, I don't know if by default they're always set to tournament objects. These ones aren't. The tournament object isn't ticked. Make sure this is checked. So always have this ticked if it's a tournament object. Otherwise, it's going to draw the tournament objects in. Even when you're not playing in tournaments, they're just going to appear in a normal round, which you don't want. So that's the only difference between tournament object planting and any other planting, is check that that tournament object is checked before you plant them.